This is the Royal Exchange Building. It's not the original, of course, but it does look like it. And this is where Ebenezer Scrooge used to hang out and visit with his colleagues, and where the ghost of the future took him. And he realized that he wasn't standing in his normal place. So here's the Royal Exchange inside where Ebenezer Scrooge did his wheeling and dealing. In A Christmas Carol, the narrator explains, quote, Scrooge looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. Unquote. A few businessmen are discussing the recent death of an acquaintance. They consider going to the funeral, but only if there is a decent meal to be had. Other than that, they show no interest in the dead man. Scrooge, of course, does not understand that they are referring to him. The first Royal Exchange was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, and the second burned down in 1838. This is a painting of the third and current building, opened in 1844, a year after A Christmas Carol was published. It seems as if Dickens had the second building in mind for Scrooge, as the third was still incomplete. I'm standing here in Newman's Court on Cornhill Street. This is the most probable location that Charles Dickens had in his mind for Ebenezer Scrooge's counting house, where he worked with his faithful clerk, Bob Cratchit. He would have also been working in this court with Jacob Marley, who had just recently passed on. And in A Christmas Carol, it basically opens here in Newman's Court with Scrooge's counting house. So I'll just take a little shot. You can see how tall the buildings are here, again, like in Fagin's Lair. And these little tiny courts are very common to get away from the noise, like I mentioned before. Now, the reason why Newman's Court was a probable location is because Scrooge mentions when he leaves his counting house, he can hear the bells pealing from a church across the street. And St. Michael's is directly across the street, which we're going to look at next. I know this is a little difficult to make out, but you can see the twin spires of St. Michael's Church here where the bells would toll. And those are the bells that Ebenezer Scrooge could hear from inside Newman's Court at his counting house. The narrator brings the St. Michael's bell to life by describing how, quote, the gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, unquote. Dickens also mentions the nearby mighty mansion house, the residence of the Lord Mayor, and the fact that when Bob Cratchit leaves the office, he, quote, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, unquote. Just imagine Bob Cratchit sliding on the ice down Cornhill Street on his way home to Camden Town. It would have been a long walk to Camden, roughly 3.5 miles, and in the snow it would have probably taken Bob 3 hours to get home. Of course, it was Christmas Eve, and he was anxious to celebrate with his family, but not before Scrooge accuses him of picking his pocket every 25th of December and warning him to be at work all the earlier the next day. The George and Vulture Inn, the melancholy inn where Scrooge took his melancholy dinner. Again, the most likely place that Charles Dickens used in A Christmas Carol, the place where Ebenezer Scrooge dined directly after he left his counting house and before he walked home, where he encountered Jacob Marley's face on the door knocker. Charles Dickens also ate and drank in the George and Vulture. Here we get a sense of how much a penny pincher Scrooge is when he replies to the waiter who informs him that bread would be extra. No more bread. Dickens also used this inn as a setting in his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. Samuel Pickwick and his faithful servant Sam Weller, who was famous for his humorous metaphors, known today as Wellerisms, stay in this inn when Pickwick returns to London to defend himself against a breach of marriage contract lawsuit. Dickens describes the rooms, quote, in very good, old-fashioned, comfortable quarters, unquote. And Pickwick later recommends it to his friend Winkle, who moves in here with his new bride. On a side note, the proprietors of the inn were kind enough to give me some background on the Pickwickians Club, descendants of Charles Dickens who hold their annual banquet here, and are adamant that the George and Vulture was, in fact, the inspiration for Scrooge's dining establishment and not Simpson's Tavern next door. Of course, I'm sure the owners of Simpson's Tavern would disagree. It's kind of like the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. You can really get a sense of the tightness of these little courtyards and alleyways. You can even kind of hear my echo here. And this is really evocative of the 19th century and how close everything really was. Just imagine Ebenezer Scrooge walking down this dark courtyard after his meal at George and Vulture Inn. I'm standing here in 4 Brabant Court, which is a very likely place that Dickens used for Scrooge's house. So if you can see on here, there is a door knocker. Can you just picture Jacob Marley's face staring out at Scrooge from this door knocker? Now we know this could be a likely place because Scrooge in A Christmas Carol describes the courtyard where he lived as if somebody just picked up a house somewhere out of London and just dropped it in a place where it really didn't belong. And as you can see, this house, which is an historic house today, is just in some kind of a random courtyard here where it appears as if it was just kind of dropped here. So we don't know for sure if this is the court that Dickens used, but it is a very likely place, one of the very likely places that Dickens used for Christmas Carol for Scrooge's house. Scrooge. Dickens writes of Scrooge's domicile, quote, they were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again, unquote.